Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to journalist Ericka Andersen about why so many women have stopped going to church and why that matters not only for them, but for the rest of us. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, reformers, social entrepreneurs, nonprofit executives, religious leaders, scholars, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. My name is Jeremy Beer. Thank you for joining us. All right, thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on September 26, 2023. I am in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm very happy to have with me today a guest from the great state of Indiana, Ericka Andersen, a freelance journalist. Ericka is the author of a new book titled Reason to Return: Why Women Need the Church and the Church Needs Women. So we'll be talking mostly about that book with her today. But let me call to your attention the writing Ericka does regularly for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Christianity Today, World Magazine, and other outlets, which writing, importantly, has included the topic of philanthropy over the years, and I hope we'll get into that a little bit as well. Ericka is also the author of a previous book titled Leaving Cloud 9, The True Story of a Life Resurrected from the Ashes of Poverty, Trauma, and Mental Illness. Ericka Andersen, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Thanks for taking time out of your day as a working mother, as we talked about before you jumped on here. You're juggling many things on your end, so I appreciate it. And it's great to talk to you about this new book of yours, Reason to Return. Let's probably should begin with the facts. So to what extent are women de-churching, to use sort of the au courant term, and are they doing so at a higher rate than men?
Yeah. So traditionally and historically, women have always been a larger makeup of the church than men, which I didn't even really know that until a few years ago. I thought it was really interesting. And over the years, as we've seen people leaving the church, men have traditionally left at faster rates than women. Like it's always been faster on the men's side. But I ran into this research, which is really the inspiration for this book, showing that for the first time, women were starting to leave church faster than men. And I just found that very concerning and upsetting. And as a Christian that really values the church and understands the role of church in society, I felt compelled to speak out on this and inform people because I really feel like there's a lack of information. So yeah, it's happening. It's still happening. COVID made it worse for everybody. But it's important because of the way it affects society and families and lots of other things.
Have other people picked up on this trend that women are leaving at a faster rate than men? I don't know that I've sort of been following this myself quite a bit. And I don't think I ever heard that myself.
I really haven't seen other people talking about that specific aspect of it. Certainly there's conversations around things like abuse in the church and the hashtag Church2 movement that are like tangentially related to that. But I don't really see that conversation specifically about women leaving at faster rates.
I want to get into the reasons why, and that's going to be a lot of our conversation, I'm sure, why this is happening. And maybe this isn't the right order to do these questions. You could tell me, but I wanted to ask you whether are there particular or certain demographics that are de-churching at slower or faster rates than others? I mean, from a class perspective, race perspective, whatever it might be, geography perspective.
Yeah. So single women and single moms are leaving at the fastest rates. Single moms, I think, at the highest rates. And that is, because of a lot of things. Single women and single moms often feel like they don't fit. They don't have a place in the church. They're not maybe ministered to well enough. And single women specifically, you hear things like they don't feel appreciated, they don't feel seen. And so I think that's really good information for the church to have, because we can then alter our path and sort of behavior in how we are outreaching to those specific demographics.
So you mentioned a couple now, and I give you a chance to sort of really elaborate here. What are the biggest reasons? Maybe you just mentioned them. Women are leaving the church.
Those weren't the biggest reasons, believe it or not. The biggest reasons that people have left the church are due to circumstances and convenience and changing culture. What you'll find is that as the culture has become more and more post-Christian, it's just not as integrated into the fabric of our society as it was faith. People have let go of church for things like soccer practice or soccer games and just apathy, just sort of like they stopped going. It wasn't an intentional decision, but maybe they stopped going and just meant to get back into it and never did. Interestingly, moving, if you move, that is a huge deterrent for getting someone back to church. You see people, intending to find a church, but then they never do. COVID definitely made more people leave church and not come back. Now the levels are close to what they were before COVID, but they are still slightly lower. And so it's a lot of that kind of thing, even more so than a lot of the bigger issues that we hear so much about in the news, which certainly play into it. We hear about the church abuse scandals. We hear about the churches that got really political over the past 3, 4, 5 years or so. And some of those reasons are in there, but I think those are overstated in terms of why people are leaving. I think we've got more people out there. And you mentioned before we started talking the book, The Great De-Churching. And that's a book I just finished. And it was interesting reading that book because there's so much that they dove into that I was like, yep. Like that's kind of, I wrote about that, not to as they're kind of go more in depth into the research in their book. But what they found, I want to say the number was 51% of those who have left church are willing to go back or want to go back. And that's a lot of people. I mean, that's a lot of hope. And I definitely want to zoom in on that hope because I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Okay, there's some ironies in here. Soccer momism didn't start in the last 5 to 10 years. People didn't have busy lives starting in the last 5 to 10 years. Why now? There's still something missing to me, especially at a time when I think it's fair to say that most churches across most denominations have consciously tried to be more consumer friendly, if you will, over the last generation. And yet we see an accelerated rate of leaving the church, especially among women. Something isn't adding up here.
So I think those reasons that people have been leaving faster in the past 10 years or so are very nuanced. One of those is the fact that we are a more post-Christian culture. Church used to be just kind of like the thing that you do. And those kinds of values, Judeo-Christian values, were more integrated into just everyday life. And as we have moved more into this progressive future, faith has become more what people want it to be, what they make it. It's more about yourself. We have a lot of these sort of spiritual mentors and gurus that are out there with these loud voices. People you hear from people like Brene Brown or Glennon Doyle Melton, or some of those folks are sort of filling spiritual gaps for women in a way that faith and church did. And they think they're going to be able to find that more fulfilling side of spirituality outside of church. And so I think because of the options and because of the culture, that those things combined have really just drawn people out. And then as well, thus the news that has come out about abuse and misogyny and things like that, that doesn't help. That pushes people out even further. And so I think those things are a big part of it.
You write in the book about the unintended consequences of the evangelical shift away from, quote, public professions of faith experienced in community to focusing on believers' personal relationships with Jesus, end quote. Could you talk about that? This is essentially about what Billy Graham sort of wrought unintentionally, perhaps.
Right. Yes. Love Billy Graham. Not trying to hate on Billy Graham.
Sure. No hating on Billy Graham. Moving on.
No hating on Billy Graham. I think he did, obviously amazing things. He preached the gospel all over the world. But what was lost in sort of this era of our Christian history was a lot of the communal aspects of faith. When the church started 2,000 years ago, it was very communal. It was, sharing possessions and giving to the poor together and doing life together, worshiping together, all of these things. And it was reading scripture aloud to a group. And all of these things were like all about together and your brothers and sisters in Christ, and go and tell everyone. And at this point in American life and in American Christianity, Billy Graham and sort of those people in that time period sort of made it more about, well, Christianity is really just about your personal relationship with Jesus and your personal salvation. And so as long as you accept Jesus into your heart, like, cool, you're going to heaven and that's it. And while that may be true, according to Christian faith, that may be doctrinally true, it took away from the richness and the really fabric of the way that God intended the church to be, which was the body together, one another, like the Bible talks about. And so people became very focused on their individual relationship with God. And I think ultimately that led to some of what we see today, where we're not thinking about other people and we're not understanding the purpose of the church. There's also a lack of biblical education and continuing education about scripture, about theology, about the church. Like, we're missing Sunday school in churches across the country. Like, Sunday school is no longer what it used to be or even there anymore. It's been replaced by small groups, and small groups are good. But in losing that, people have lost an understanding of what it means to be the church and what we're called to.
How did online streaming contribute to the problem of dechurching, and should churches discontinue that practice entirely?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, so many churches ultimately ended up streaming that didn't before COVID, and that was necessary. And I think it's good that we have that for when it's needed, and it's good that we have that for like people that really can't get to church. But again, that is a very small number of people at this point in time. I do think that it's given people an out. It's made them think that they're going to church when they're not. They're really consuming a sermon, which is fine. It's fine to consume a sermon. I listen to sermons on podcasts, but you're not being the church. You're not participating in the church when you're at home watching a sermon, and you're not interacting with people, and you're not building people up, and you're not there performing the part of the body that you are. Now, church, I caveat there to say, like, church is not just Sunday morning. It's not just the sermon. Church is participating in life with people on Wednesdays, on Sundays, and being there for people in a much broader way. But watching the sermon online and not being there in person to lift up and edify your fellow church members is really taking away from what it's intended to be.
Would you not do it if you were a church leader? Would you stream live?
I don't know that it needs to be live. Like, let's maybe post it later. That's what my church does. They don't stream it live. They just post it later in the day or the week. And I think that's better, because at least then, like, you have a reason to go. You can't be like, oh, I'll just watch it online. It's like, well, it's not going to be happening live. So yeah, I think that's how I would do it.
You talk about the problem of spiritual numbness. What do you mean by that? And to what factors do you ascribe that phenomenon? I will say I'm often struck myself at how it seems very peculiar, our era, in the sense that so many people seem so dead to the mystery that surrounds us, to matters of the spirit. It's clearly something that any thoughtful person sort of had to think about and reflect on in previous ages, that people somehow get away with not reflecting on at all now. Or so it seems. That's what I think of when you say that. But what do you mean by spiritual numbness?
Yeah, well, I believe on the back cover of the book, it talks about, there's a line that says this book is for people who have been physically or spiritually absent from the church, which really, was something that I identified with at a time in my life when I would be at church, but it was like I was just going. It wasn't meaningful. It wasn't really doing anything. And so I think spiritually numb can also mean like spiritually absent, like performing the actions, but not actually participating in this relationship with God. And also, it's not necessarily easy to describe, but just that feeling when like, you know that you have faith, but you're like, I don't feel God. I don't feel that this is working in my life right now? And I think we can get to that place when we're not taking care of ourselves spiritually. So I talk a lot about how spiritual wholeness requires different aspects of caretaking, just like physical health. And so, some of those components are being a part of a church. They're reading scripture. They're spending time alone in prayer. They're spending time in worship. And in order to have spiritual health, you've got to be doing those things. And so spiritual numbness is going to happen if you're not sort of giving yourself the nutrition that you need in order to upkeep that. And I think a lot of people have that problem and they don't realize, I'm not reading the Bible. Maybe that would jog me out of some numbness. There are things you can do just like you can for your body, for your spiritual health.
I'm glad you touched on health because that's what I want to turn to next. It's a relationship between being churched and health. But first, we'll take a break. We'll be right back with Ericka Andersen, author of Reason to Return. Be right back.
Hey folks, I'm Jack Fowler, the author of Civil Thoughts. That's the free weekly email newsletter for the Center for Civil Society at AMPHIL, where we try to strengthen civil society. Civil Thoughts gives you a dozen plus recommended readings. Here's a link. Here's an excerpt of important articles and essays that I've come across in the previous week. I think anyone who's intelligent, dear intelligent American, that you will like it. So how do you get Civil Thoughts? Well, you go to civilthoughts.com, sign up. Trust me, it's totally free, risk-free. We're not selling your name to anybody. You'll enjoy it. civilthoughts.com.
All right, we are back with journalist Ericka Andersen. She is the author of Reason to Return, Why Women Need the Church and the Church Needs Women. And we'll turn a little bit to health now, since you brought that up before the break. You have a chapter on loneliness, which has become rather unexpectedly one of the themes of this podcast. Rates of depression among women alone have tripled since the pandemic began in 2020. Those are your words. Talk about your argument that depression is not always a problem with your brain, again, your words, but is often, quote, a problem with your life.
I think I referenced this book in the book. And it's called, now I'm going to forget the name of this book. Johann Hari. He's the author. I did not remember the name of the book right now. So depression, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't take me at that value. But I will say that while depression, I think, is certainly affected by our brain chemistry, I do think that our circumstances in life bring about that. Like if we're going through a time of grief or a time of really difficult struggle, it can be more powerful in our life. And I think that, the more we see people leaving faith community, the more they have that depression has a chance to get a hold of them because they're not surrounding themselves with life. Like life begets life. So you surround yourself with people that care about you, that care about your well-being. I just really envision it you're getting an infusion of life into you when you're around them. And when you separate yourself from people, that's very bad for you. That's unhealthy. And God created us for that community. You can look at any study, whether we're talking about church or not, people that are involved and not isolated have better health. They're less depressed. They're happier. They're all of these things. But when you add that faith component, that supernatural component for Christians, it's even to a greater extent, as you see in some of the stats I mentioned in the book about, lower rates of heart attacks and cancer and suicide and all of these things. I think I heard somebody put it one time in an op-ed, if you had a magic elixir that you could take and improve your health and happiness in your life overall, that magic elixir would be church attendance on a weekly basis. And it's really amazing when you look at the numbers.
It is church attendance. I want to sort of dwell on and emphasize the fact that it's not, I participate in church by vaguely being part of a community of people who we say we're with the church, or right, by watching online or just being a member of a church. Maybe I government. Now, it is regular church attendance.
Or by saying that I'm a Christian. It's not that either.
Right. A sort of simply a faith commitment. Exactly. There are, by the way, the book is Lost Connections by Johann Hari. I found it while Ericka was talking. What are some of the other significant relationships, if we haven't touched on them yet, maybe we have now, between being churched and mental and physical health? I mean, it's extraordinary. People
have stronger friendships. They have more friends. And as you know, because we've talked about this and you do this, people that are regular church attenders are far more generous. They give not only to the church, but we see their giving numbers exceeding non-churchgoers by leaps and bounds for secular causes as well. Everything from, the Red Cross or the American Cancer Society to the Humane Society. They are out giving the rest of society. And like you said, the church attendance thing really makes a big difference. It's like, are you attending church 3 or 4 times per month is like the kind of the standard. And when you look at stats out of COVID, this is like my favorite COVID stat, if you can say that. The only people that reported higher mental health in 2021 post-COVID were those who were regular church attenders. Not another demographic in the whole country reported. Everyone else reported lower mental health, except for those who consistently were attending church throughout COVID. I think that includes online, but I don't know. Most people, like my church reopened like just 2 or 3 months after March. So I was back in person pretty quickly myself. So I don't know, say what you will, but I think there's something special. There's something spiritual and supernatural about church because God is there. And one more thing I'll just say on that I love when I was doing research for this book is that the church is the embassy of heaven. I heard an author put it that way, and I just thought it was so beautiful. Like, so when you walk into the church, like you're technically in heaven, which is so crazy. Just like you would walk into the German embassy in Washington, D.C., you're technically in Germany. The church is the embassy of heaven. And so there is something special about that group of people. It's not the building, it's the people.
But it does take place in a building.
It does take place in a building. You can't avoid that usually.
Or a cove or something.
Something.
A place, an embodied place. What's interesting about the philanthropy stuff is that, not only, and people have heard this, if you've listened to this podcast, you've heard this over and over about how people who regularly attend church give more than those who don't, even to secular causes. But it's particularly disturbing, not only about sort of what we call the rise of the nuns, people, the religiously unaffiliated, the people who don't attend any sort of religious services regularly, but women stereotypically are often decision makers on philanthropy in families. And if women are leaving church at a higher rate than men, then this is even a bigger problem for philanthropy potentially than even I had been thinking. So there's some more bad news. Well, let's go back. Let's get to the solution side of this, right? What would be your advice? And you have a lot of it in the book. I should be very clear. This is not a theoretical book. It's a very practical, personal, inspirational book. What would be your advice to a woman who had stopped going to church but is looking for a path back, or at least thinking about taking that kind of step?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on the person that you're talking to. So I would, kind of change my, tune depending maybe on the individual. But a couple of things that I talk about there are talking with people about, because I think people get roadblocked when thinking about where to go. They maybe decide they don't want to go to the church they used to go to or the place they went growing up, but it's intimidating and overwhelming to go somewhere new. And it almost feels, it can be so overwhelming that you just never make a decision. And I think that's a real big problem. And so I encourage people to think about what it is they want in a church and then kind of do some exploring, like go online and look around Facebook groups, local Facebook groups where you ask like, hey, I'm looking for a church that's kind of like this or that. Church people will jump all over that. I see it every day in the moms groups. If somebody asks for a church, there's like, a million people like my church. And that's how I found a church of mine in the past. And I kind of went through the list and you start kind of looking around, check their websites. There's some practical, tips out there about like, what do what's most important and this and that. So just be curious to start with and don't rush it. It's, it's a big decision. So don't rush it. Lead with prayer. Just ask God to lead you. I mean, I think that's really important. and recognize that church doesn't have to look the same as it did before. The church of your past doesn't have to be the church of your future. We have so many different kinds of churches in this country. It's really great that we have those kinds of options, and it's not necessarily like going to be simple decisions. So like mentally prepare for, you're going to have to visit a few places and all of that. But what I say to all that, because somebody may hear that and they go, that sounds like a lot of work, but it's like, think about why this matters and why this matters for your family, maybe your kids. Like, this is your life. This is your eternity. Is your spiritual health important? Can you really afford to put it on the back burner? Are there things that you're prioritizing that could get put second? Are you where you want to be, or are you where you want to, are you taking steps to where you want to go? One of the stats that I really love is not really love, but that sort of inspired this is that, I think it was a Barna survey that said like women are saying the number one thing they want to prioritize in their lives is their faith life. But when you ask women, what are they actually prioritizing? It comes in fifth. And so we can see there's a disconnect. Women want to do this, but they're not doing it. And so I'm trying to say, let's fix the disconnection, because you want to do this, but you have to take steps. Anything worth doing, anything worth doing is hard. But like, really think deeply about this, like bigger than just like, I'm going to church on Sundays. It's like, this is a full life decision. And so I try to get into that in some of those chapters as well.
Are women kept from doing so, from matching up what they say is their top priority with their actions by intransigent or lazy men? Or are they kept from doing so by churches that are not as friendly or as welcoming or open as they could be to women, or single women perhaps in particular? Like, what's the reason for that disconnect? It's got to be one.
I mean, I think the reason is, especially with younger, like I would say like women in their like 20s to 40s, that are raising kids, especially, it really is the busyness of life. It sounds like a cop-out, but it really is the busyness of life and how this culture does not prioritize faith or church anymore. And that is part of it. I also think I don't think it's churches not being welcoming necessarily. I think for the single women, I think that's maybe a different scenario for them. But I think most churches are just dying for people to come in the doors. Like they just will do anything to get you in the door. Like, we want you to come to church, And so there's certainly improvements to be made. But I think really this comes down to women looking at their lives and being like, what's important for me? And they have to decide for themselves. Nobody can do it for them. And I think even hearing this information and just becoming conscious of the fact that this decision has to be intentional is going to be helpful, especially knowing that over 50% of people that have left want to come back and will come back. And the most likely way that people will come back to church is through being invited by a friend. Classic, invite your friends to church advice.
Is that your advice for church? I mean, you said you don't think there's a whole lot churches can do or should do, but that's not going to be, they're dying for people to come. In fact, that should be one of those funny, church signs,
Yeah.
Dying for you to come to church. Is there practical steps? Jim Davis has some in his book. He has some ideas, and maybe you want to comment on some of the ideas presented in The Great Dechurching. Yeah.
So something that I talk about a lot is, because I'm not getting into the argument about egalitarianism, complementarianism, like that's not my lane. But what I do talk about is, regardless of what kind of church you go to, I think that the staff really needs to be seeking out the voices of women in a more prominent way. More than half your congregation is a woman. And so if you are not consulting with women about how to run things and maybe topics to cover or scriptures to cover, like, a man can think like a woman. A male pastor needs to have input, like wise input from women of the church, and not just his wife, like other people too. And so I think that should be something that's really intentional. I think bigger churches certainly can do more like honed in outreach to different demographics when they have that capacity. The vast majority of churches in America are not mega churches. Most of them are like 200 or less people. And so they're not going to have the resources to do that. But just even knowing this information and being conscious of the fact that women are leaving I think that's going to help church leaders even just be thinking that way and having it in their heads as they're planning out the coming year, which is why I always say, like, I want my book to get out to churches and ministries because I want them to be aware of this phenomenon that's happening so that they can speak to it and make plans accordingly.
In light of your research, like we've been saying here about sort of the lack of the social incentives that used to exist for people to go to church, not only are no longer there, it's completely the opposite, right? All the incentives are to not be a church attender, at least in most communities. In light of that, what hope do you see for re-churching women, perhaps in particular, but maybe men too?
Well, I'm very encouraged by the stats from the Great De-Churching about the percentage of people that are willing to go back. That is a lot of hope to me. I also have a lot of hope in church plants. Something people maybe not know is that when a church is planted, they really attract non-churchgoers or unchurched people at a much higher rate. And so as we plant new churches, that is going to bring new life. And so big fan of planting churches. And sometimes it's time for a church to close. Sometimes a church doesn't have to live forever. A church should be planting new churches and bringing fresh life out into various communities. And I think the more local you can get, the better. I think, somebody's going to be more likely to walk over across the street than they are to drive, 20 minutes down the road. And so I think more churches is better. I know that a great organization to follow for that is Exponential. And so, yeah, I do have hope. I mean, I also know that whatever is happening, like the Bible says the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. And so nothing is going to destroy the church or, the faith. And in the West, in like Africa and India and in the East and things right now, like Christianity is growing by leaps and bounds. So America has a problem, but the rest of the world is doing really well in some places. And so I really gather a lot of hope from our brothers and sisters across the ocean.
I don't think you're the only one. Ericka, thanks so much for doing this today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ericka Andersen, author of Reason to Return, Why Women Need the Church and the Church Needs Women. Available everywhere, like all books are today. As I always say, it's available on Amazon, but try not to buy it there if you can. Bookshop.org, a Libris, use something else. Give those Amazon drivers a break. Ericka, you're also on everything, right? Twitter, Facebook.
Yes, all the
Instagram,
things.
all the
Look me up.
It's Ericka, CK, ERICKA. And then it's Andersen with an E at the end, erickaandersen.com. You can find all of Ericka's writing and a bunch of content. So Ericka, thanks so much for being with us and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe and or rate and review this discussion on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. And have a guest you'd like to hear from? Send your request to our producer, Katie Janis, at kjanis@amphil.com. That's KJANUS@amphil.com.